I went to his office to beg for my husband's life, but I left with a diamond collar and a new master. He didn't want my money, he wanted to own me completely. And the most terrifying truth? I found that I liked the submission more than I loved my husband. Now, standing in the courtroom, I have to make a choice: save the man I married, or send him to hell just so I can stay in paradise. Morning in the 4th residential sector began with a deceptive, heavy sort of calm that always made me nervous. Through the thick, cloudy glass of our single window, which was permanently coated with a greasy film of urban soot and industrial fallout, a few rare and pale rays of sunlight tried to fight their way through to the floor. They illuminated the tiny kitchenette where I stood, casting long, dancing shadows against the peeling beige paint of the walls. I stood by the electric stove, watching the water boil, my hand moving in a slow, hypnotic rhythm as I stirred the instant coffee in the small copper pot. It was a powder we had bought on the black market, a small luxury that Tom and I allowed ourselves only on the weekends, a way to pretend we were not drowning. The aroma that rose from the pot was sharp and chemically enhanced, lacking the rich depth of real beans, but to me, it smelled like heaven. It was a synthetic scent, engineered in some laboratory to mimic the real thing, yet it successfully created a fragile illusion of a normal life. It reminded me of the stories the elderly residents in the building would tell in hushed tones, stories about a time when the world was different, when people like us did not have to hide in the shadows of the megastructure. I inhaled deeply, letting the steam warm my face, trying to block out the reality of the cramping apartment that smelled faintly of recycled air and old dampness. This was our ritual, the one thing they had not yet figured out how to tax or regulate out of existence for people of our class. Tom was sitting at the small, scratched table behind me, his posture slumped in a way that made my heart ache with a fierce, protective love. He was scrolling through the morning news feed on his tablet, the screen of which was crisscrossed with a spiderweb of cracks we could not afford to repair. In the harsh, unforgiving light of the morning, his pale skin looked almost translucent, like parchment paper held up to a flame. I could see the blue veins pulsing faintly at his temples. His shoulders, usually tight with the tension of survival, were finally relaxed for the first time in a long, grueling week of physical labor at the reclamation facility. I watched the way his fingers swiped across the glass, his movements slow and deliberate, conserving energy for the coming days. He must have felt my gaze on him because he lifted his head and looked into my eyes. A slow, tired smile spread across his face, and in that simple expression, there was so much warmth that it nearly brought me to my knees. For a fleeting second, the constant, low-frequency hum of the surveillance drones patrolling outside the window faded into the background. I forgot about the notification I had received yesterday stating that our rent was being adjusted upward again due to the demographic tax. I forgot about the way my own hands ached from scrubbing floors in the upper levels. There was only him, his blue eyes, and the silent understanding that we were the only thing that mattered in this cold, concrete world. I turned off the stove and walked over to him, placing the steaming cup near his hand. The ceramic clinked softly against the table, a domestic sound that felt incredibly precious. I stood behind him and ran my fingers through his thinning blonde hair, feeling the warmth of his scalp. A wave of absolute peace washed over me, a sensation so rare it felt almost illicit. This tiny room, with its leaking faucet and humming ventilation, was our fortress. It was a sanctuary carved out of a hostile city, a place where the new social hierarchy could not touch us, where we were just a man and a woman trying to survive. I leaned down, resting my cheek against the top of his head, breathing in the scent of soap and fatigue, wishing this moment could freeze in time forever. Suddenly, the air in the room was sliced open by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was not the polite chime of a guest requesting entry, nor was it the maintenance buzz. It was the sharp, shrieking wail of the security override, a sound designed to induce panic and submission. We both froze, our moment of connection shattered instantly into 1,000 jagged pieces. The calm morning evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline that tasted like copper in my mouth. On the wall, the master interface screen flared to life, pulsing with an angry, aggressive red light that bathed the kitchen in the color of blood. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I stared at the flashing display, unable to comprehend that our sanctuary had been breached. A mechanical, dispassionate voice filled the small space, bouncing off the walls with terrifying volume. It announced that a violation of the civil code of the third degree had been detected. The words seemed to float in the air, surreal and nightmarish. The voice continued, stating that an order for the immediate isolation of the subject, Thomas R., had been issued. Before my mind could even process the meaning of the words, before I could grab Tom's hand or scream, the pneumatic locks on our front door disengaged with a loud, hydraulic hiss. The heavy metal door slid aside with a speed that defied the usual sluggishness of the building systems, leaving us exposed and vulnerable to the corridor beyond. We barely had time to stand up from the table. Tom scrambled backward, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, his face draining of all color. Into our home stepped two figures that seemed to suck the light out of the room. They were clad in the sleek, black tactical armor of the Department of Control, their faces hidden behind polarized visors that reflected our own terrified expressions back at us. On their chests, the gold insignias of the new elite authority gleamed with an arrogant luster. They moved with the precision of machines, filling our small kitchen with an aura of violence and undeniable authority, marking the end of our peace and the beginning of a nightmare I was not ready to face. The journey to the city center felt less like a daily commute and more like an interplanetary voyage across a hostile and dividing galaxy. I stood in the crowded vestibule of the high-speed maglev train, pressing my forehead against the cold, vibrating glass of the window, desperate to catch a glimpse of the world rushing by. Outside, the familiar, suffocating landscape of the outskirts blurred into streaks of gray and brown, a monochrome testament to neglect and decay. We were passing through the buffer zones, the endless miles of concrete hives and crumbling infrastructure where people like me lived out our small, gray lives. The buildings here were like tombstones, packed tight together, shrouded in the eternal smog that clung to the lower levels of the atmosphere like a dirty shroud. As the train accelerated, the vibration against my skull intensified, a low hum that seemed to resonate with the anxiety coiling in my stomach. I watched as the gray slums began to thin out, replaced by the imposing security barriers that marked the perimeter of the inner sanctum. These were massive walls of reinforced steel and sensor arrays, designed to keep the chaos of the poverty-stricken sectors from spilling over into the manicured perfection of the elite. Passing through the checkpoint was a visceral experience. The train slowed momentarily, the lights flickered as the scanners swept over us, verifying our transit passes and genetic markers, reminding us that we were only guests in the world we were approaching. Then, in a breath of transition that always felt miraculous and cruel, the world changed. The smog layer broke as if cut by a knife, and the sun, which was a pale, sickly disk back home, suddenly burst forth with blinding intensity. We had entered the golden quarter. The gray concrete vanished, replaced by soaring spires of glass and biometal that twisted toward the sky in impossible, organic shapes. These buildings didn't just scrape the sky, they seemed to embrace it, their surfaces reflecting the sunlight in dazzling prisms of gold and azure. It was a landscape of aggressive perfection, where every line was calculated, and every surface was polished to a mirror shine. The train hissed to a halt at the Central Plaza station, the doors sliding open with a smooth, expensive whisper that was worlds away from the grinding clatter of the transport in my sector. I stepped out onto the platform and was immediately struck by the air. It didn't smell of burnt rubber, recycled waste, or the metallic tang of industrial exhaust. Here, the air was crisp, chilled to perfection, and smelled faintly of ozone and synthetic jasmine. It was rich air, filtered and perfumed, a commodity that was pumped into the streets of the Golden Quarter to shield its inhabitants from the reality of the dying planet outside their walls. I took a shallow breath, feeling like an intruder just by inhaling it. I pulled my worn, gray trench coat tighter around my body, a futile attempt to make myself smaller, to disappear into the background. The fabric was fraying at the cuffs, and the color had long ago faded to a nondescript shade of misery, marking me instantly as an outsider. Around me, the platform was teeming with the true residents of this world, and the contrast was agonizing. They moved with a fluidity and confidence that I had never possessed, a physical manifestation of their absolute security. They were the masters of this new era, tall and statuesque, their skin tones ranging from deep, lustrous ebony to rich, warm bronze, glowing with health and genetic optimization. They wore clothes that I could only dream of touching, let alone owning. I saw tunics of genuine silk that rippled like water, structured jackets made of natural wool, and trousers of linen that had never known a synthetic blend. The colors were vibrant, royal purples, emerald greens, and deep crimsons, fabrics that breathed and moved with them. In a world where my people wore recycled plastics and rough polymers, seeing natural fibers was a display of wealth so profound it felt like a physical blow. I kept my eyes down, navigating the stream of bodies, terrified of making eye contact, terrified of seeing the disdain that I knew would be lurking in their gaze. The street level was even more overwhelming. I walked quickly, my boots clicking softly on the pristine pavement that seemed to be self-cleaning, absorbing the dust before it could settle. Above me, the sky was a piercing, unblemished blue, likely color-corrected by the atmospheric domes that shielded the district. I felt the heavy, invisible weight of the surveillance systems pressing down on me. I knew that thousands of cameras and biometric scanners were tracking my heat signature, analyzing my gait, and cross-referencing my identity with the temporary pass I had secured. I was a glitch in their perfect system, an anomaly that was being tolerated only because I had paid the right price to the right person. The memory of that transaction made my stomach churn with a fresh wave of nausea. Securing an audience with a district curator was theoretically impossible for a citizen of my standing. We were supposed to interface with automated kiosks and low-level AI adjudicators. But desperation had made me resourceful. I had spent 3 days navigating the dark web channels, finding a corrupt secretary in the scheduling department. The bribe had cost everything, literally everything. Our meager savings account, the emergency fund stashed in digital credits, even the small inheritance my mother had left me. I had transferred it all into an untraceable account just to get a 15-minute slot on a Tuesday morning. The administration building loomed ahead of me, a terrifying structure that dominated the plaza like a black monolith. It was built from a dark, light-absorbing material that seemed to drink in the sun, standing in stark contrast to the glittering glass towers around it. It was a fortress of bureaucracy, the heart of the machine that controlled our lives. The architecture was designed to intimidate, to make the individual feel microscopic and irrelevant. As I approached the massive entrance, the sheer scale of the doors made me dizzy. They were 3 times the height of a man, solid and impenetrable, guarding the power that lay within. I hesitated for a fraction of a second at the bottom of the stairs, my nerve failing me. I thought of Tom, sitting in a holding cell that smelled of urine and despair, waiting for a savior who was currently trembling in her boots. I pictured his hands, rough from work but gentle when they touched me, and that image gave me the strength to take the first step. I ascended the stairs, feeling the eyes of the elite guards on me. They stood like statues at the entrance, their armor polished to a lethal shine, their hands resting casually on weapons that could vaporize me in a heartbeat. They didn't stop me, likely having received the clearance code from the bribed secretary, but their silence felt more threatening than a shout. The interior of the building was a cathedral of silence. The noise of the city was instantly cut off as the heavy doors closed behind me, replaced by a hush so profound it rang in my ears. The lobby was vast, a cavern of polished black marble and chrome, cooled to a temperature that made me shiver in my thin coat. The air conditioning whispered like a distant wind, the only sound in the immense space. There were no chairs, no waiting areas, just a long, lonely walk to the reception desk that sat in the center of the room like an altar. The lighting was recessed and clinical, casting no shadows, leaving nowhere to hide. Behind the desk sat a woman who looked more like a fashion model than a receptionist. Her skin was the color of midnight, flawless and radiant, and her hair was sculpted into intricate, geometric braids threaded with gold wire. She didn't look up as I approached. Her attention was focused on the holographic interface floating above the marble surface. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, shifting my weight from foot to foot, clutching my bag with white-knuckled hands. I was invisible to her, a piece of furniture, until she decided to acknowledge my existence. When she finally deigned to look at me, her eyes were cold, sweeping over my shabby appearance with a boredom that cut deep. I stammered out my name and the appointment time, my voice sounding thin and pathetic in the echoing acoustic of the lobby. She didn't speak, simply tapped a few keys on her interface, her long, manicured nails clicking against the hard light. A green light flashed on the security gate to my right, and she gestured toward it with a dismissive wave of her hand. I muttered a thank you that she didn't hear and hurried toward the elevators, feeling like a rat scurrying across a ballroom floor. The elevator ride was smooth and silent, lifting me higher and higher into the stratospheres of power, away from the ground, away from reality. The corridor on the top floor was lined with artwork that probably cost more than the entire GDP of my residential sector. Abstract sculptures of light and sound floated in alcoves, shifting colors as I walked past. The carpet was thick and plush, swallowing the sound of my footsteps, making me feel like a ghost. At the end of the hall stood a pair of double doors made of a dark, heavy wood that looked ancient and priceless. There was no keypad, no handle, just a seamless surface that radiated authority. I smoothed my hair, wiped my damp palms on my coat, and took a deep, trembling breath. This was it. The point of no return. The door swung open silently as I approached, revealing the inner sanctum. The office was enormous, a sprawling expanse of luxury that spanned the entire width of the building. One wall was floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the city below, a god's-eye view of the world. The furniture was minimalist but clearly bespoke, arranged with a geometric precision that bordered on obsessive. But my eyes were drawn instantly to the figure seated behind the massive desk at the far end of the room. Mr. Marcus. He was the center of gravity here, the black hole around which everything else revolved. He was sitting in a high-backed leather chair, his attention fixed on a series of floating holographic reports that hovered in the air before him. He was a striking man, in the prime of his life, with broad shoulders that filled out his suit with an effortless grace. His skin was a rich, deep bronze, glowing under the ambient lighting, and his features were sharp and aristocratic. He wore a suit of charcoal gray, the fabric shimmering slightly as he moved, cut to perfection to emphasize his physique. He exuded a calm, terrifying power, the kind of authority that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. He didn't look up when I entered. He didn't acknowledge the sound of my footsteps or the soft click of the door closing behind me. He continued to manipulate the data streams with his fingers, his movements precise and elegant, like a conductor leading an orchestra. I stood in the middle of the room, feeling small and foolish, waiting for permission to speak, permission to breathe. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy, pressing against my chest. I realized then that to him, I was less than a petitioner. I was a minor distraction, a fly buzzing at the edge of his perception. I knew that Tom had absolutely no chance in the regular courts. The justice system had been fully automated a decade ago, handed over to unfeeling algorithms that processed humans like data points. Those algorithms were programmed with biases that were never spoken aloud but were felt by everyone in my sector. If you were poor, if you were white, if you lived in the outer rings, you were guilty until proven otherwise, and you were never proven otherwise. The conviction rates for my demographic were nearly 100%. My only hope, our only hope, was the discretionary power of a district curator, a human override in the machine. I cleared my throat, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to desecrate the perfect silence of the room. Mr. Marcus? I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't react. I took a step closer, forcing myself to be brave. Sir, my name is Alice. I have an appointment. Still nothing. He swiped a graphic away, his face impassive. I realized I just had to start talking, to pour it all out before he had me removed. I began to speak, my words tumbling over each other in a rush of panic and sincerity, trying to bridge the infinite gap between us. I told him about the morning raid, about the sirens and the tactical team. I explained that there had been a terrible mistake, a misunderstanding of catastrophic proportions. It's about the industrial filters, I said, my voice gaining a little more strength as I focused on the facts. My husband, Tom. He's accused of stealing platinum core filters from the reclamation plant. But that's impossible, sir. Physically impossible. I tried to explain the logistics, how the filters were too heavy for one man to carry, how the security sensors at the plant would have triggered instantly. I laid out the logic, the alibis, the sheer absurdity of the charge. He's a good man, I pleaded, wringing my hands together. He's never broken a law in his life. He works double shifts. We just want to live quietly. We don't cause trouble. I watched his face desperately, looking for a flicker of recognition, a twitch of sympathy, anything. But his expression remained as smooth and unreadable as the glass wall behind him. I talked about Tom's health, about how he wouldn't survive the penal colonies, about how we were willing to pay any fine, do any community service. I debased myself, offering up our dignity on a platter, begging for mercy from a man who looked like he had never needed to ask for anything in his life. Please, sir, I said, my voice cracking, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. The system. The algorithm, it doesn't see the truth. It only sees statistics. But you have the power to look at the evidence. You have the power to stop this injustice. I was rambling now, repeating myself, throwing words into the void in the hope that one of them would stick. I felt a rising tide of hysteria, a screaming panic that I was failing, that I was blowing the only chance we had. I talked until my throat was dry, until I had exhausted every argument, every plea, every shred of logic I had prepared. And then, I ran out of words. The silence crashed back into the room, louder and more oppressive than before. I stood there, chest heaving, hands trembling, waiting. Mr. Marcus sat motionless. He hadn't looked at me once during my entire speech. His eyes were still fixed on the hovering blue light of the hologram, his finger poised in midair as if considering a data point that was infinitely more interesting than the weeping woman in front of him. The indifference was absolute. It wasn't that he hated me, it was that I barely existed in his dimension. I stood frozen, the realization of my own powerlessness washing over me like ice water, waiting for a judgment that felt like it had already been passed. The silence that followed my desperate plea was so heavy it felt almost physical, a tangible weight pressing against my eardrums and compressing the air in my lungs. It was not the peaceful silence of an empty room, but the terrifying, suspended silence of a courtroom just before a verdict is read. The faint, rhythmic hum of the building's climate control system seemed to amplify, sounding like the heartbeat of a massive, indifferent beast. I stood there, my hands trembling where they gripped the strap of my worn bag, feeling the moisture on my palms turn cold. Every second that ticked by felt like an hour, stretching my nerves until they were ready to snap. The light from the panoramic window washed over the room, but it offered no warmth, only a harsh, clinical illumination that exposed every fray in my coat and every line of exhaustion on my face. For a long, agonizing moment, Mr. Marcus did not move. He remained frozen in his tableau of power, his eyes still fixed on the blue light of the data stream, his finger hovering over a column of numbers. I began to wonder if he had even heard me, or if I had been speaking on a frequency too low for his elite senses to register. Then, with a slowness that was terrifyingly deliberate, he swiped his hand through the air, extinguishing the hologram. The blue light vanished, plunging the space around his desk into a more natural, yet somehow more ominous, shadow. The sudden absence of the digital distraction signaled a shift in the room's gravity. His attention, which had been scattered across a dozen virtual reports, was about to focus entirely on a single, biological point, me. Slowly, the leather of his high-backed chair creaked, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet. He rotated the chair, the mechanism smooth and silent, until he was facing me directly. The movement was unhurried, the action of a man who owns time itself and feels no need to rush for anyone. When his eyes finally locked onto mine, I felt a physical jolt, as if I had touched a live wire. I had expected anger, annoyance, or perhaps the same bored dismissal I had received from the receptionist. I had prepared myself for scorn. But what I saw in those dark, intelligent eyes was something far more unsettling. There was no pity there, no trace of human sympathy for a wife begging for her husband's life. Instead, his gaze was filled with a cold, calculating curiosity. It was the look of a scientist examining a specimen under a microscope, or an entomologist who has stumbled upon a rare and slightly repulsive insect in the wild. He wasn't seeing Alice, the woman from the fourth sector. He was seeing a representative of a dying breed, a biological curiosity that had wandered into his domain. His eyes swept over me, dissecting me, analyzing the fear in my posture, the poverty of my clothing, and the desperation in my soul. It was a look of assessment, weighing my value not as a human being, but as a potential asset, a variable in an equation I didn't yet understand. He placed his hands on the polished surface of his desk, his fingers long and manicured, contrasting sharply with the dark wood. With a fluid, powerful motion, he pushed himself up from the chair. He was taller than I had realized, his stature imposing, casting a long shadow across the carpet. As he stood, the perfectly tailored fabric of his suit moved with him, emphasizing the width of his shoulders and the controlled strength of his body. He didn't speak. He simply stood there for a moment, letting his physical presence wash over me, establishing a hierarchy that went beyond rank or wealth. He was the predator, apex and assured, I was the prey, frozen in the open. Then, he began to move. He walked around the edge of the massive desk, his steps silent on the plush carpet. He didn't walk directly toward me at first, he moved in a slow, deliberate arc, like a wolf circling a trapped animal. I wanted to step back, to retreat toward the safety of the door, but my feet felt leaden, nailed to the floor by the sheer force of his will. I turned my head slightly to track him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a frantic bird. He was closing the distance, collapsing the safety bubble of personal space that I had tried to maintain. Every step he took was a violation, a silent assertion of his right to be anywhere he chose, including inside my guard. As he came closer, the air around me changed. The sterile, recycled smell of the office was suddenly invaded by a new scent, something rich and complex. It was his cologne, a fragrance that smelled of expensive sandalwood, dark spices, and something musky and primal. It was intoxicating and overwhelming, a scent that spoke of old money and new power. It wrapped around me, clouding my senses, making it hard to think clearly. It was a smell that didn't belong in my world of bleach and ozone, a sensory invader that signaled his proximity more effectively than a touch. He stopped just inches from me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to see the golden flecks in his dark irises. I held my breath, afraid that even the sound of my exhalation would offend him. He looked down at me, his face impassive, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the center of my chest. "The law is a rigid thing, Alice," he said softly, using my name with a familiarity that felt like a caress and a threat all at once. "It is a structure of steel and code, built to maintain order in a chaotic world. It does not care about tears. It does not care about intentions. It only cares about results." His voice was hypnotic, smooth and dark like melted chocolate, wrapping around the harsh reality of his words and making them sound like philosophy rather than a death sentence. However, he continued, taking a half-step closer, invading my space until I had to tilt my head back to look at him. "Steel can be bent, if one applies the right amount of heat. And code can be rewritten, if one possesses the master key." He paused, letting the words hang in the air between us. "The system is absolute for the masses, but for those of us who stand at the controls, it can be flexible." He let the word flexible roll off his tongue slowly, tasting it. "But flexibility is a resource. It is not given away freely. It is invested. It is reserved for those who prove themselves to be useful." My mind raced, trying to decode the meaning behind his words. Useful? What use could I possibly be to a man who controlled the district? I had no money, no connections, no technical skills that weren't redundant in this automated age. I can work," I stammered, my voice trembling. "I'm a hard worker. I can clean. I can do administrative tasks. I'll do anything to pay off the fine. Put me on a debt contract. Please." I was offering him my labor, the only currency I had ever known. I was trying to negotiate a transaction in the language of the poor, trading sweat for survival. Marcus tilted his head slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement, it was a smile of pity mixed with something darker. "You misunderstand," he murmured. I do not need a cleaner. The droids keep my floor spotless. I do not need a clerk. The AI handles my schedule. He moved his hand, bringing it up slowly between us. I flinched, expecting a blow or a dismissal, but his hand stopped in the air, hovering near my face. I have no need for your labor, Alice. That is a commodity with no value here. His hand moved closer, and then, with a weight that shocked me, he laid his palm on my shoulder. The contact was electric. His hand was heavy, warm, and undeniably possessive. His fingers curled slightly, gripping the fabric of my cheap coat, pressing down into the muscle beneath. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was a claim. It was the way a man touches something he intends to buy, testing the quality of the merchandise. Through the layers of my clothes, I felt the heat of his skin, and a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold air conditioning raced down my spine. I am not interested in your money, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was intimate and terrifying. And I am not interested in your sweat. His thumb brushed against the side of my neck, a deliberate, lingering touch that sent a jolt of panic through me. What I require is something far more archaic. Something that cannot be automated. In that moment, looking into his dark, heavy-lidded eyes, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The ambiguity vanished. I understood exactly what he was asking for. He didn't want a servant. He wanted a pet. The dynamic between us crystallized instantly. I was a woman of the old majority, the demographic that had once held power but was now sliding into irrelevance and poverty. He was the new elite, the ascendant class that now ruled the megacities. For him, owning me, bending me to his will, wasn't just about sex. It was about history. It was about symbols. Having a white woman from the lower sectors at his mercy, dependent on his whim for her very survival, was the ultimate status symbol. It was a manifestation of the total victory of the new order. The realization made my stomach churn with a mixture of nausea and a strange, hot shame. Fear flooded my system, bitter and cold. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run. I should slap his hand away, scream for help, and dash for the elevator. I should preserve my dignity, my honor, the sanctity of my marriage. But then, superimposed over the face of the man standing before me, I saw Tom. I saw his pale, terrified face in the glass box of the courtroom. I saw him being dragged away to the recycling colonies, where the life expectancy was measured in months. I saw the empty side of my bed. I saw the future without him, a gray, endless tunnel of grief and solitude. If I walked out of this door now, I kept my pride, but I killed my husband. It was a binary choice, brutal in its simplicity. The system had designed it this way. It had stripped us of all other options until only this one remained. I stood frozen under Marcus's hand, the fight draining out of me like water from a cracked vessel. I didn't pull away. I didn't step back. I stood there and let him hold me, let him feel the frantic pulse in my neck, let him savor the knowledge that he had trapped me. My silence was his answer, and he knew it. His grip on my shoulder tightened slightly, a gesture of approval and dominance. He stepped in even closer, eliminating the last fraction of distance between us. His body was a wall of heat against mine. He leaned down, his face passing my line of sight until his lips were right beside my ear. I could feel his breath, warm and scented with mint, against my skin. The charges against Thomas can be reevaluated, he whispered. Errors can be found in the logs. But such corrections require a great deal of my personal attention. And if I am to devote my attention to your needs, you must devote yourself entirely to mine. He paused, letting the implications sink in deep. Not just once, he murmured, his voice sending tremors through my limbs. But whenever I summon you, you will be mine, Alice. In every way that matters. You will belong to this room, to this office, to me. The words were a shackle, snapping shut around my wrists. He was proposing a life of secret servitude, a shadow existence where I would trade my body and my will for Tom's freedom. It was a devil's bargain, etched in the air between us. The room seemed to spin slowly. I closed my eyes, shutting out the gold and glass of his world, trying to find a center of gravity. I thought of the synthetic coffee this morning. I thought of Tom's smile. I thought of the love that was the only real thing I possessed. And then, with a sense of detachment that felt like I was watching someone else, I made my choice. I opened my eyes and looked at the expensive silk of his tie. I took a shallow breath, and I nodded. It was a small movement, barely an inch, but it shattered my old life completely. The air in the room instantly electrified, as if a circuit had been completed. Marcus pulled back slightly to look at my face, and the expression he wore was terrifying. It was satisfaction. Pure, undiluted satisfaction. He didn't look triumphant in a vulgar way. He looked like a man who had just acquired a masterpiece for his collection. The coldness in his eyes warmed into something else, a dark, hungry heat. He moved his hand from my shoulder to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, pulling my head back gently but firmly, forcing me to expose my throat to him. "Good," he said, the words simple and final. "Very good." The touch was possessive, humiliating, degrading. And yet, somewhere deep in the darkest, most repressed corner of my mind, a tiny spark ignited. It wasn't pleasure, not yet. It was a reaction to the sheer, overwhelming power he radiated. For years, I had been fighting a losing battle, struggling to survive, carrying the weight of the world. Now, suddenly, I was in the grip of someone who had the power to make the problems vanish. There was a twisted, seductive relief in the surrender, a dark thrill in being completely at the mercy of a superior force. He didn't kiss me. Not then. That would have been too romantic, too equal. Instead, he ran his thumb across my lower lip, tracing the shape of it, asserting his ownership. "We will begin immediately," he stated, not asking, but commanding. He turned and walked back toward his desk, not even looking back to see if I followed, because he knew I would. He knew he had bought me, body and soul. I stood there for a second, feeling the ghost of his touch on my skin, my heart racing with a mixture of terror and a strange, dizzying anticipation. I had come here to save my husband, but as I took my first step toward the man who now owned me, I knew I was walking into a fire that would consume the woman I used to be. The fall had begun, or perhaps, in this twisted new world, it was an ascent. 2 weeks had dissolved into a blur of disjointed realities, a schizophrenic existence where I was torn between two completely incompatible worlds. My life had become a pendulum swinging violently between the suffocating, gray poverty of the 4th residential sector and the blinding, golden brilliance of the city center. I felt less like a person and more like a vessel being emptied and refilled with different substances every 24 hours. The time spent in my own apartment, the place that was supposed to be my home, had transformed into a necessary purgatory, a waiting room where I simply existed in a state of suspended animation until I could return to the heights. The air there felt stale, recycled too many times, tasting of dust and the lingering despair that seemed to seep out of the very walls. I would wake up in my cold, narrow bed, the sheets damp with the humidity of the failing ventilation system, and for a moment, I would not know who I was. Was I the wife of an accused criminal, struggling to pay the electric bill? Or was I the creature who existed in the penthouse, the woman who drank wine that cost more than my monthly rent? The transition was becoming harder to navigate. In the beginning, the return to the apartment had felt like a grounding mechanism, a reminder of what I was fighting for. Now, it felt like putting on a suit of clothes that was 2 sizes too small, a constricting, itchy fabric of morality and struggle that I was desperate to shed. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching the cheap plastic furniture with a sense of alienation, realizing that the objects that used to define my life now looked like garbage. The phone calls from the detention center were the anchors that dragged me back to the reality I was trying to escape. Every other evening, at exactly 1900 hours, the secure line would chime. The connection was always poor, the video feed grainy and prone to freezing, reducing Tom to a collection of pixelated blocks and distorted audio. Seeing his face, pale and drawn, surrounded by the harsh, unforgiving light of the holding cell, used to break my heart. It used to make me weep with a fierce determination to save him. But as the days turned into weeks, a subtle, terrifying shift had occurred in my chest. The pity was still there, yes, but it was now laced with a dark thread of irritation. His vulnerability, once something I wanted to protect, now seemed merely pathetic. Tom would look at me through the screen, his eyes wide with a desperate, frantic hope that I found increasingly hard to stomach. He would ask the same questions, his voice trembling with the fear of a man who knows he is standing on the precipice of oblivion. He asked about the lawyer I had supposedly hired, about the motions I was filing, about the evidence I was gathering. He clung to the fiction of a legal defense like a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. And I, looking into the eyes of the man I had vowed to love and cherish, would lie to him with a smoothness that frightened me. The lies didn't stick in my throat anymore, they flowed like oil, slick and easy. "It's going well, Tom," I would say, my voice steady and reassuring, practicing the tone of the capable, loyal wife. "The public defender is actually very good. We found a discrepancy in the logs. It just takes time. Bureaucracy is slow." I invented meetings that never happened, cited legal precedents I had made up on the spot, and fabricated progress out of thin air. I watched the relief wash over his face, watched his shoulders relax, and I felt a strange, cold detachment. I was feeding him hope, but it was a synthetic hope, a placebo to keep him quiet while I did what actually needed to be done. I told myself it was kindness. I told myself he couldn't handle the truth of what I was doing to save him. But deep down, in the dark corners of my mind that I tried not to examine, I knew that the lying was becoming a habit I enjoyed. It was a form of control. In a world where I had no power, holding the truth back from him gave me a secret leverage. I was the architect of his reality. He was living in a world I created for him, while I lived in the real one. When the timer on the call would hit 0 and the screen would go black, I didn't feel the crushing weight of sadness anymore. I felt a release. I felt the shackles of my old life loosen, allowing me to breathe again. I would stare at the blank screen for a moment, then stand up, wash my face, and begin the ritual of preparing for the other life. The journey to the Golden Quarter was no longer a terrifying expedition into enemy territory, it was a pilgrimage to the source of my new power. I learned to walk differently as soon as I crossed the transit threshold. I stopped hunching my shoulders. I stopped looking at the ground. I walked with my chin up, mimicking the arrogant, gliding stride of the women I saw on the high streets. I wasn't one of them, not really, but I was connected to one of them, and that connection was a shield that deflected the scrutiny of the surveillance drones and the judgment of the crowds. I wore the clothes Marcus had bought for me, not the cheap synthetic blends of the sector, but soft, tailored garments that whispered of money, and I felt the city open up to receive me. The arrival at Marcus's building was always the moment when the transformation solidified. The residential tower was a spire of black glass and obsidian, a fortress of wealth that pierced the clouds. In the beginning, the lobby staff, the genetically enhanced concierges and security officers, had looked at me with open disdain. I was trash that had blown in from the gutter, tolerated only because the master willed it. But 2 weeks had changed everything. They had seen me come and go. They had seen the car Marcus sent for me. They had seen the way he placed his hand on the small of my back when we entered the elevator. Now, when I pushed through the revolving doors, the atmosphere in the lobby shifted instantly. The head concierge, a man with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that usually held nothing but contempt for my kind, would straighten his spine. He would nod to me, a gesture that was respectful, almost deferential. "Good evening, Miss Alice," he would say, his voice lacking the sneer it once held. It wasn't respect for me as a person, it was a recognition of my status as property of the highest order. They feared Marcus, and by extension, they had to fear me. I was the favorite, the chosen one, and in the strict hierarchy of the service class, that placed me above them. I drank in their deference like a fine wine. It was intoxicating to see fear in the eyes of those who should have been my superiors. The elevator ride to the penthouse was a silent ascent into the heavens. As the numbers on the display climbed higher, leaving the smog and the noise of the lower city far below, I felt a physical reaction in my body. My heart rate would accelerate, not with dread, but with a humming, electric anticipation. My skin would flush, and my breathing would become shallow. I was ascending to Olympus, leaving the mortal world of debts and hunger behind. When the doors slid open to reveal the expansive, dimly lit apartment, the smell of sandalwood and ozone would wrap around me like a lover's embrace, triggering a Pavlovian response of surrender. Marcus was rarely waiting by the door. He didn't need to greet me, he knew I would come. I would find him in the main lounge, usually standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a god's-eye view of the sprawling metropolis, or sitting in his leather armchair with a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He would look up as I entered, his expression unreadable, calm, possessing the stillness of a predator that has already eaten but is always ready to hunt again. There were no pleasantries, no questions about my day or my feelings. Those things belonged to the world of equals. Here, there was only the binary of will and obedience. "Come here," he would say, his voice low and vibrating through the quiet room. It wasn't a request. It was a command that bypassed my logical brain and struck directly at the primitive center of my nervous system. And I would go to him. I would cross the expanse of the expensive Persian rugs, feeling the softness under my feet, feeling the gravity of his presence pulling me in. With every step, Alice the wife, Alice the struggler, Alice the victim, evaporated. In her place stood the other woman, the one who existed only to be looked at, to be touched, to be used. The intimacy that followed was never tender in the traditional sense. There was no romance, no fumbling declarations of affection. It was a precise, calculated exercise in power. Marcus didn't make love to me, he claimed me. He reaffirmed his ownership with every touch, every look, every movement. And God help me, I craved it. In the bedroom, amidst the sheets of Egyptian cotton and the heavy velvet drapes, I discovered a dark, secret truth about myself that I had never dared to articulate. I liked the submission. I liked the absolute negation of my own will. For my entire adult life, I had been carrying the weight of the world. I had been the one worrying about credits, about food rations, about keeping Tom's spirits up, about surviving the next day. It was a crushing, relentless burden. But here, in Marcus's shadow, that burden didn't exist. I didn't have to think. I didn't have to decide. I just had to be. When he held me down, when his hands mapped the contours of my body with possessive entitlement, I felt a profound sense of safety. It was the safety of the cage, perhaps, but it was safety nonetheless. He was a monster to the world, a tyrant of the administration, but that meant nothing could hurt what belonged to him. And I belonged to him. One evening, the sky outside was a canvas of deep violet, bruised with the neon glow of the city lights. We were in the bedroom, the air heavy with the aftermath of our encounter. I was sitting at the vanity table, a piece of furniture that was an antique from a century ago, staring at my own reflection in the gilded mirror. I looked different. My hair was smoother, my skin seemed to have lost its gray pallor, flushed with the heat of the room and the food I had been eating. Marcus moved behind me, his reflection joining mine. He was wearing a silk robe, his chest bare, looking like a dark king surveying his domain. He reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out a long, slender velvet box. He didn't say a word. He simply placed it on the table in front of me. My breath hitched. I opened it slowly, my fingers trembling slightly. Inside lay a necklace of white gold, set with sapphires that were so dark they looked almost black. It was exquisite, a piece of jewelry that likely cost more than Tom would earn in 10 lifetimes of labor. It was heavy, cold, and magnificent. I looked up at Marcus's reflection, expecting to see a smile, but his face was serious, intense. "Put it on," he murmured, his hands resting on my bare shoulders, his thumbs pressing into the soft skin near my neck. I lifted the necklace, the metal feeling like ice against my fingertips. I fastened the clasp at the nape of my neck, the click sounding loud in the silence. The stones settled against my throat, a cold, heavy weight that felt like a yoke. I looked back at the mirror. The woman staring back at me was a stranger. The jewels didn't look out of place. They looked like they belonged there. They transformed the simple curve of my neck into something valuable, something to be displayed. Beautiful, Marcus whispered, leaning down to kiss the sensitive spot just behind my ear. It suits you. It marks you. The double meaning hung in the air. It wasn't a gift of love, it was a collar. It was a tag that said property of the administration. And instead of feeling shame, instead of tearing it off and throwing it at him, I felt a surge of pride. The sapphires caught the light, sparkling with a cold fire. They were a shield. No one would dare touch a woman wearing this. No police drone would scan me, no hunger would touch me. I turned my head to look at him, my eyes meeting his in the glass. The fear that had defined my life for so long was gone, replaced by a strange, narcotic high. I realized then that the eroticism of our encounters wasn't just about the physical act. It was about the proximity to power. It was about being elevated above the filth and the struggle of the masses. I was sleeping with the enemy, yes, but the enemy was a god in this city, and sleeping with a god made you something more than human. In that moment, the memory of Tom felt distant, like a dream from a past life. Tom was weak. Tom was a victim. Tom was the embodiment of everything I was trying to escape. He couldn't protect me. He couldn't give me diamonds. He couldn't make the world stop with a wave of his hand. Marcus could. The contrast was brutal and undeniable. I leaned back against Marcus, feeling the solid wall of his chest, feeling the beat of his heart against my back. I let my head fall onto his shoulder, exposing the necklace, exposing my submission. The guilt should have consumed me. I should have been sick with self-loathing. But as I watched the city lights twinkle below us, millions of little lives struggling in the dark while I sat in the tower, I felt only a cold, hard satisfaction. I had traded my soul, perhaps, but I had gotten a very good price for it. The necklace felt heavy, grounding me in this new reality. I was no longer just a desperate wife trying to save a husband. I was the favorite. I was the concubine. And as Marcus's arms wrapped around me, locking me into his world, I finally admitted the truth to myself. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to go back. I liked the view from the top too much. The day of the trial loomed on the calendar like a dark, encroaching storm front, a fixed point in time that I had been sprinting toward with a desperate, singular focus. Every heartbeat for the last month had been dedicated to this deadline, every breath taken with the intention of dismantling the trap that had snapped shut around Tom. But when the summons came, it did not arrive with the usual ominous fanfare of the evening hours. It came in the middle of the day, a bright Tuesday when the sun was high and scorching against the glass shielding of the city. My personal communicator buzzed not with a text, but with a direct priority link request from the administration. The screen simply flashed a single command: come. Now. It was stripped of the usual bureaucratic pleasantries, a raw imperative that bypassed the need for politeness. The journey back to the administration building felt fundamentally different from that first, terrified pilgrimage I had made weeks ago. I was no longer the trembling petitioner in the fraying coat, clutching a bag of desperation. I sat in the back of the automated sleek black sedan that Marcus had sent for me, watching the city blur past through tinted windows that turned the world into a sepia-tone movie. The leather seats were cool against my legs, the air conditioning was scented with lavender, and a chilled bottle of water waited in the console. I caught my reflection in the dark glass. I looked composed, severe, almost regal. The woman who had cried in the lobby was dead, replaced by a creature who knew the access codes to the sky. When I arrived, the building no longer seemed like an impregnable fortress designed to crush me. As I walked across the vast, echoing lobby, the space felt familiar, almost welcoming in its cold, austere way. The receptionist with the geometric braids did not ignore me this time. She stood up as I approached, her expression a careful mask of professional deference, perhaps even tinged with a flicker of envy. She swiped her pass to open the express elevator before I even reached the gate. I walked through without breaking my stride, the click of my heels on the marble sounding like the ticking of a clock counting down to zero. I was ascending, rising above the smog, rising above the law, rising toward the sun. The elevator doors slid open to reveal the corridor that led to the inner sanctum, but the air here felt charged today, heavier than usual. It wasn't the weight of intimidation I had felt before, it was the heavy, static pressure of a decision waiting to be made. I pushed open the double doors to his office and stepped inside. The room was exactly as it had been on that first day, the panoramic view, the minimalist furniture, the silence that swallowed sound, but the dynamic had shifted tectonically. I wasn't walking in as a stranger. I was walking in as a part of the room's ecosystem, a piece of the furniture that had come to life. Marcus was waiting for me. He wasn't sitting behind the fortress of his desk this time. He was standing by the window, looking out at the sprawling, metallic organism of the city below. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture rigid and commanding. He didn't turn immediately when I entered. He let me walk halfway across the room, let me feel the texture of the carpet, let me breathe in the scent of his domain. When he finally turned, his face was stripped of the usual mask of amused detachment. There was a gravity in his eyes, a seriousness that chilled my blood and thrilled me simultaneously. He didn't offer a drink. He didn't ask me to sit. He simply gestured toward the desk. I walked over to the massive slab of dark wood, my heart rate picking up a strange, syncopated rhythm. Lying in the center of the desk, isolated like a sacrificial offering, was a single data tablet. It was active, the screen glowing with a soft, white light. I looked down at it, and the words swam into focus, stark and official. Release order, subject Thomas R. Disposition, immediate discharge. All charges dropped. It was a miracle encoded in digital text. It was the thing I had sold my soul for. It was the end of the nightmare. All it needed was the biometric authorization of the district curator. It needed his thumbprint, and Tom would be free. My hand reached out instinctively. It was a reflex born of weeks of agonizing worry, a physical manifestation of the promise I had made to my husband. I reached for the tablet, my fingers trembling slightly, ready to grab it, to clutch it to my chest, to run to the detention center and scream the good news. But just as my fingertips brushed the cold glass of the screen, a shadow fell over the desk. Marcus had moved with that terrifying, silent speed of his. His hand, large and warm and heavy with authority, came down and covered mine. He didn't grab me. He didn't squeeze. He simply laid his hand over mine, trapping it against the desk, pinning my good intentions to the wood. I froze. The breath caught in my throat. I looked up at him, startled, expecting to see anger or a change of heart. But his expression was calm, almost inquisitive. He wasn't stopping me from taking the papers, he was pausing the moment. He was forcing me to live in the split second between the wish and the fulfillment. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and impenetrable, and in them, I saw a question that didn't need to be spoken aloud. It was a question that cut through the layers of my deception and went straight to the rot growing in my heart. Are you sure? His eyes seemed to ask. Are you absolutely certain this is the ending you want? The silence in the room stretched thin, vibrating with tension. Under the weight of his hand, I became acutely aware of the contrast between our skin. His was dark, warm, pulsing with the vitality of the ruling class. Mine was pale, cool, the skin of the defeated. But together, touching, they created a circuit of heat that was undeniable. He didn't speak, but the choice he was offering hung in the air like smoke. I could push his hand away. I could take the tablet. I could go down the elevator, go to the prison, and get Tom. And then what? The reality of that, then what, crashed into me with the force of a physical blow. I saw the future in a flash of terrifying clarity. I saw us returning to the fourth sector. I saw the peeling paint on the walls that always smelled of damp plaster. I saw the leaking faucet that dripped, dripped, dripped through the night, a torture device we couldn't afford to fix. I saw the synthetic coffee in the mornings, the taste of chemicals and despair. I saw Tom, broken by his time inside, jumping at shadows, his spirit crushed, looking at me with those grateful, puppy dog eyes that I had come to despise. I saw the constant, grinding fear of the next bill, the next raid, the next humiliation. I saw a life of gray struggle, a slow suffocation in the mediocrity of survival. Then, I looked at the man standing before me. I looked at the cuff of his shirt, perfectly starched, the gold link glinting in the sunlight. I looked at the room, this sanctuary of power high above the clouds. Staying here meant safety. It meant that when I walked into a room, people lowered their eyes. It meant wine that tasted like fruit and earth, not chemicals. It meant silk against my skin instead of rough recycled cotton. But more than the material comfort, it meant proximity to the sun. Being with Marcus, being his, gave me a borrowed radiance. I was no longer a victim of the system, I was sleeping with the architect of the system. The realization hit me that there was no room for 3 people in this equation. The space at the top of the pyramid was narrow. If I took the tablet, if I saved Tom, I lost Marcus. I would be cast out of Eden, sent back to the mud to toil and rot. The door to the penthouse would close, and the lights would go out. I would be just Alice again. Just a wife. Just a nobody. The thought made my stomach clench with a visceral, violent panic. It felt like dying. The idea of returning to that small, scared life felt like being buried alive in a coffin I had already outgrown. Marcus saw the shift in my eyes. He saw the moment the hesitation turned into realization. He felt the tension leave my hand, not because I was pulling away, but because I had stopped reaching for the tablet. His thumb moved, stroking the back of my hand in a slow, rhythmic caress that was possessive and incredibly intimate. "You have fulfilled your duty," he said softly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through my bones. "You have fought for him. You have done what a good wife is supposed to do." He paused, leaning closer, his scent of sandalwood and musk filling my senses. "But is that who you are now, Alice? Are you still just a wife?" The question hung there, sharp and dangerous. Am I? I looked at the release order again. It didn't look like a victory anymore. It looked like a sentence. It looked like a ticket back to hell. I realized with a jolt of horror that was quickly swallowed by a darker thrill that I didn't want Tom to be free. Not if his freedom meant my captivity in poverty. I didn't want to go back to being the strong one, the one holding everything together. I wanted to be held. I wanted to be owned. I wanted the crushing, overwhelming weight of Marcus's power to shield me from the world. A spark ignited in the space between us, brighter and hotter than any simple lust. It was the recognition of a shared darkness. Marcus knew what I was thinking. He knew I was weighing a human life against a diamond necklace, against a view of the skyline, against the feeling of his hands on me. And he knew, with the arrogance of a god, which way the scale would tip. He moved his hand from mine, sliding it up my arm, over the fabric of the expensive dress he had bought me, up to my shoulder, and then to my neck. His grip was firm, claiming me, holding me in place. "There is a place for you here," he whispered, his face inches from mine. "A permanent place. Not as a visitor. Not as a petitioner. But as mine." The words were a spell, weaving a cage of gold around me. "But you know the cost, Alice. You cannot have both worlds. You must choose where you belong. Do you belong in the mud, or do you belong in the sky?" The dichotomy was false, cruel, and absolute. He was forcing me to burn the bridge while I was still standing on it. I closed my eyes, and the image of Tom and his cell flickered in my mind. For a moment, I tried to summon the love I had felt for him, the tenderness of our mornings, the shared history. But the image was pale, washed out, like an old photograph left in the sun too long. It was dissolving, turning into static. In its place, the sensation of Marcus's hand on my throat grew stronger, more real, more vital. The heat of his body was the only reality that mattered. Tom was the past. Tom was the anchor dragging me down. Marcus was the current pulling me forward. I opened my eyes and looked up at him. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I let my hand drop from the tablet, letting it lie there on the desk, ignored and abandoned. I leaned into his touch, tilting my head back, baring my throat in a gesture of absolute submission. It was a surrender, yes, but it felt like a victory. It felt like I was finally shedding the skin of a life that had never fit me. I saw the triumph flare in his eyes, a dark fire that consumed the last of his professional distance. He pulled me to him, his arms sweeping around my waist, crushing me against the hardness of his body. The contact was shocking in its intensity. It was an embrace that promised protection, but demanded everything in return. When he kissed me, it wasn't gentle. It was hard, demanding, a seal stamped onto a document of ownership. It tasted of power. It tasted of the future. I kissed him back with a desperation that surprised us both, my hands clutching at his lapels, anchoring myself to him. In that kiss, the final threads of my old morality snapped. I realized that the excitement I felt, the trembling in my knees, wasn't just fear. It was a dark, narcotic arousal born of status. I was aroused by his authority, by the way he could grant life or death with a signature, by the fact that he had chosen me. I loved the feeling of being subordinate to a king more than I had ever loved being equal to a pauper. The shame flared for a second, hot and bright, and then was extinguished by the overwhelming relief of knowing I would never have to worry about the rent again. As his hands moved over me, possessive and sure, the office seemed to shrink around us, shutting out the rest of the world. The tablet on the desk was forgotten, a meaningless artifact of a life I had already discarded. I was no longer the woman who had come to beg for mercy. I was the woman who had accepted a throne, even if it meant sitting at the foot of it. Returning to the poverty of the fourth sector wasn't just a step backward, it was a form of suicide. I chose survival. I chose the gold. I chose the monster, because the monster had the keys to the castle, and I was done standing outside in the rain. His courtroom was a study in absolute, blinding white, a sterile purgatory designed to strip the human soul of its shadows and secrets. The walls were panels of backlit alabaster that emitted a hum so low it was felt in the teeth rather than heard by the ears. There were no windows here, no glimpses of the chaotic city outside or the smog-choked sky. This was a hermetically sealed chamber of judgment, a place where the air was scrubbed of all scent and temperature, maintained at a constant, clinical chill that discouraged passion and induced a shivering compliance. I stood at the heavy double doors at the back of the room, pausing for a moment to let my eyes adjust to the aggressive brightness. The light seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, erasing depth, making the people inside look like two-dimensional cutouts pasted against a blank canvas. I smoothed the fabric of my skirt with a hand that was steady, terrifyingly so. The suit I wore was a masterpiece of tailoring, a garment of charcoal silk and structured wool that Marcus had selected for me only hours ago. It fit like a second skin, accentuating the new posture I had adopted, spine rigid, chin elevated, shoulders back. It was armor. The Alice who had worn fraying polyester and apologized for her own existence had been left behind in the penthouse, shed like a dead husk. My hair was pulled back into a severe, intricate chignon that exposed the long line of my neck, and the sapphire necklace lay cold and heavy against my throat, a collar of ownership that I wore with a twisted, secret pride. I took a deep breath of the sanitized air, tasting the metallic tang of ozone, and pushed the doors open. The sound of my heels striking the polished white floor was sharp and authoritative, cutting through the murmuring silence of the gallery like a gavel strike. Every head turned. I felt the weight of their gazes, the bored administrative clerks, the robotic legal aides, the few spectators from the lower districts who had come to witness the machinery of justice. But their eyes slid off me like water off oil. I was armored in the visible markers of the elite, the cut of my clothes, the jewelry, the sheer arrogance of my entrance. I didn't look at the floor. I didn't hunch. I walked down the central aisle with the gliding, predatory grace I had learned from watching the women in the Golden Quarter, moving as if the very space belonged to me by divine right. Tom was standing in the accused box to my left, a cage of reinforced, soundproof glass that rose from the floor to the ceiling. He looked devastatingly small inside that transparent prison. 2 weeks of detention had carved the flesh from his bones, leaving him gaunt and spectral. His prison uniform was a shapeless gray jumpsuit that hung off his frame, stained with the grime of the holding cells. His hair was matted, his skin the color of old parchment. He looked like a relic from a forgotten age, a piece of debris that the city was trying to flush away. But when he saw me, his face underwent a transformation that was painful to watch. The dull misery in his eyes ignited into a frantic, blinding hope. He pressed his hands against the glass, leaving greasy smears on the pristine surface. His mouth opened, shaping my name, though the soundproofing reduced it to a silent pantomime. He was smiling, a broken, desperate smile that cracked his dry lips. In his eyes, I saw the narrative he had constructed. His wife, his brave, loyal Alice, had arrived at the 11th hour. She had performed a miracle. She had found the lawyer, found the evidence, found the salvation he had been praying for. He looked at me not just with love, but with a pathetic, worshipful gratitude that made my stomach turn. He saw a savior. He didn't realize he was looking at his executioner. I did not stop at the glass box. I did not turn to face him. I did not place my hand on the glass to mirror his. I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, staring straight ahead at the raised dais where the tribunal sat. I felt his gaze hook into me, pulling at me, trying to drag me back into the shared gravity of our past, but I severed the connection with a cold act of will. To acknowledge him would be to acknowledge the woman I used to be, and she was incompatible with the future I had chosen. I walked past him, close enough that he could probably see the sapphires at my throat, close enough that he could see the lack of recognition in my eyes. I heard a faint thud against the glass, perhaps he had tapped it, or stumbled against it, but I didn't flinch. Instead of turning toward the defense benches, I approached the stairs that led up to the high tribunal platform. This was a restricted area, a zone reserved for the magistrates and the high-ranking officials of the administration. As I placed my foot on the first step, a ripple of confusion went through the room. A bailiff half-stepped forward to intercept me, but then he saw the insignia on my lapel, a small gold pin Marcus had given me, and he froze, retreating back into the shadows. I ascended the stairs, rising physically above the level of the common floor, rising above Tom. With every step, the air seemed to get thinner, rarer, more intoxicating. Marcus sat at the center of the crescent-shaped table, flanked by two other adjudicators who looked like statues carved from granite. He was wearing his official robes, heavy garments of black and gold that made him look like a dark god presiding over a chaotic universe. He didn't look at me as I approached, he kept his eyes on the data screens embedded in the table. But I saw the slight tension in his jaw, the almost imperceptible nod of approval. There was an empty chair to his right, slightly set back from the main table but clearly part of the inner circle. I walked to it and sat down, crossing my legs, folding my hands in my lap. I was now looking down at the courtroom. I was looking down at Tom. The shift in perspective was jarring and absolute. From up here, the glass box looked like an aquarium, and Tom looked like a trapped insect. I saw the confusion spreading across his face like a slow-acting poison. He had lowered his hands from the glass. His smile was faltering, trembling at the edges. He looked from me to Marcus, then back to me, his brow furrowed as he tried to process the impossible geometry of the situation. Why was his wife sitting with the judges? Why was she looking at him with the cold, dispassionate stare of a stranger? The hope in his eyes was beginning to curdle into fear, a primal, instinctive understanding that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. Marcus leaned forward, tapping the microphone in front of him. The sound boomed through the chamber, a deep, resonant bass that silenced the last whispers of the gallery. "The court is in session," he announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "Case number 479. The People versus Thomas R." He paused, letting the silence build, letting the tension ratchet up until it was almost unbearable. "The initial charges of theft of state property have been suspended." For a split second, I saw Tom's shoulders sag in relief. He thought this was it. He thought the lie I had told him on the phone was coming true. He looked at me again, eyes shining with tears of gratitude. However, Marcus continued, the words slicing through the air like a guillotine blade. "In light of new evidence brought forward by the primary witness, the charges have been reclassified." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The boredom of the clerks evaporated, replaced by a sharp, predatory interest. The accused is no longer charged with simple theft. He is charged with industrial sabotage and conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism against the infrastructure of the Golden Quarter. A Class 1 felony. The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Class 1 meant no trial, no appeal, just disappearance. Tom reeled back as if he had been physically struck. His mouth opened in a silent scream of denial. He shook his head violently, looking around the room for someone to correct this insanity. And then, slowly, horrifyingly, his eyes locked onto mine. He saw me sitting there, calm and composed, at the right hand of the man who was condemning him. The realization didn't hit him all at once, it seeped in, freezing him from the inside out. I saw the moment the pieces clicked together. The delay, the lies, the new clothes, the jewelry, the seat on the podium. The horror that dawned on his face was total. It wasn't just fear of death, it was the annihilation of his entire world, the understanding that the person he loved most was the architect of his destruction. The court calls the primary witness, Marcus said, turning his head slightly to look at me. His eyes were dark voids, demanding payment for the life I had chosen. Alice R., please step forward. I stood up. My legs felt strong, powered by the adrenaline of the moment. I walked to the small podium at the edge of the dais, gripping the sides with hands that did not shake. I looked down at Tom. We were separated by 20 feet of air and a universe of betrayal. He was staring at me, his eyes pleading, begging me to wake up, to stop this, to be the woman he knew. But that woman was gone. She had died in a penthouse bedroom 2 weeks ago. State your name and relation to the accused, the automated court clerk intoned. My voice, when it came out, was a stranger's voice, smooth, cool, polished to a shine. Alice R. I am the wife of the accused. The words echoed in the white room. Tom flinched at the word wife. It sounded like an insult coming from my lips. Mrs. R., Marcus prompted, his voice silky and dangerous. You have provided the administration with digital logs and personal journals found in your shared residence. Can you confirm the nature of these documents? I took a breath. This was the point of no return. This was the price of the ticket. Yes, I said, looking directly into Tom's horrified eyes. I found plans hidden in the ventilation unit. Blueprints of the filtration systems. Manifestos against the administration. I paused, letting the lie expand and fill the room. He spoke often of his hatred for the order. He talked about bringing the system down. I didn't want to believe it at first. But when he brought the components home, I knew I couldn't stay silent. I had to protect the city. The lie flowed out of me with terrifying ease. It was a perfect, seamless fabrication that I had rehearsed in the mirror of the penthouse. I painted Tom not as a desperate man trying to survive, but as a dangerous radical, a monster who wanted to destroy the peace. Every word was a nail in his coffin. I saw Tom slide down the glass wall of his box, his legs giving out. He was shaking his head, mouthing no, no, no over and over again, tears streaming down his gaunt face. He looked at me not with anger, but with a shattered, incomprehensible grief. He couldn't understand how the woman he held at night could be standing there, destroying him with such calm precision. Thank you, witness, Marcus said. The testimony is accepted. The evidence is conclusive. He didn't even pretend to consult the other judges. He raised his hand, and the verdict was delivered. Guilty on all counts. Sentence: indefinite labor in the sub-level reclamation zones. Effective immediately. The gavel struck the block, a sound like a gunshot. The sublevels were a death sentence, a place of toxic fumes and radiation where prisoners lasted 6 months at most. I had just killed him. I had just sentenced my husband to a slow, agonizing death. The doors to the back of the courtroom burst open, and 2 guards in heavy tactical armor marched in. They approached the glass box, overriding the lock with a magnetic key. The glass slid open. Tom didn't fight at first, he was too broken, too stunned. But when they grabbed his arms, the survival instinct kicked in. He began to struggle, thrashing against their iron grip. He looked up at me one last time, his face contorted into a mask of pure agony. He opened his mouth and screamed my name. I saw the chords of his neck strain, saw his chest heave, but the sound was swallowed by the acoustic dampeners before it could reach the tribunal. It was a silent movie of despair. They dragged him backward, his heels scraping uselessly against the white floor. He was reaching out to me, his fingers clawing at the air, trying to grasp a ghost. I didn't look away. I didn't close my eyes. I forced myself to watch every second of it. I watched as they hauled him through the rear doors, watched his gray uniform disappear into the darkness of the corridor, watched the doors slam shut, sealing his fate. He was gone. Erased. The problem was solved. The debt was paid. The courtroom remained silent for a long moment. Then, Marcus stood up. The session was over. I felt a presence at my side, a heat that radiated through the layers of my expensive suit. Marcus moved close to me, his body shielding me from the lingering stares of the clerks. He didn't say a word about the trial. He didn't mention Tom. Instead, he placed his heavy hand on the small of my back, his fingers spreading out to claim the curve of my waist. It was a gesture of ownership, possessive and absolute. I leaned into his touch. I didn't pull away. I didn't feel the crushing weight of guilt that I had expected. Instead, I felt a strange, lightheaded sensation of relief. The burden was gone. The weak link had been severed. I looked down at the empty glass box, now just a smudge of fingerprints on a transparent wall, and I felt nothing but a cold, hard clarity. I turned to Marcus, looking up into his dark, triumphant eyes. I was safe. I was protected. I was part of the power that ruled the world. Justice was a fairy tale for the poor, for the elite, there was only strength and the will to use it. I took his arm, feeling the expensive fabric of his sleeve, and walked with him toward the private exit, leaving the white room and the memory of my husband behind in the silence.